She woke up in a hospital with no memory of even her own name, silver marks searing her skin like hot iron. The nurses whispered, "Cursed," while crossing themselves at the sight of her, but no one could explain the symbols that glowed brightly whenever the moon rose on the horizon. What she didn't know was that miles away, a mysterious man had been searching for her for decades. The first thing Helena noticed when consciousness clawed its way back to her wasn't the sterile smell of disinfectant or the rhythmic beeping of machines, but the way her skin felt like it was burning from the inside out. She jolted upright in the hospital bed, her breath coming in sharp gasps as unfamiliar pain coursed through her body like liquid fire. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with an intensity that made her temples throb, but it was nothing compared to the agony radiating from strange marks that seemed to pulse beneath her pale skin. "Miss, please lie back down." A nurse's voice cut through the haze of confusion, but Helena couldn't focus on the woman's face. Everything felt wrong, foreign, as if she'd woken up in someone else's body. Her hands trembled as she lifted them, staring at the intricate silver lines that traced delicate patterns across her forearms, like liquid moonlight trapped beneath flesh. "What are these?" Her voice came out as a whisper, barely audible above the mechanical symphony of the hospital room. The marks weren't tattoos or scars. They were something else entirely, something that made her stomach twist with a recognition she couldn't place. They seemed to shift and shimmer when she moved, catching the light in impossible ways. Dr. Morrison appeared at her bedside, his weathered face creased with concern and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "Helena, you've been unconscious for 3 days. We found you collapsed in the mountains, and frankly, we're not entirely sure how you survived the exposure. Your body temperature was dangerously low, but these markings..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that hung heavy in the antiseptic air. "I don't remember anything." The admission felt like glass in her throat. Not just the accident or whatever had happened in the mountains, but everything before that moment was shrouded in an impenetrable fog. Her name, her age, her life, all of it existed only because the hospital bracelet around her wrist told her so. Helena Blackthorne, 26 years old, no emergency contact listed. The emptiness where her memories should have been felt like a physical wound. "Memory loss isn't uncommon with severe trauma," Dr. Morrison said carefully, but his eyes kept drifting to the silver marks that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "However, these markings are unusual. We've run every test we can think of, blood work, biopsies, even brought in a dermatologist from the city. They appear to be completely integrated with your cellular structure, almost like they've always been part of you." Helena pulled the thin hospital gown tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. The marks weren't limited to her arms, she realized with growing horror. She could feel them spreading across her collarbone, spiraling down her spine in patterns that felt both ancient and familiar. When she closed her eyes, she could almost see them glowing against the darkness of her eyelids, mapping out territories she didn't understand. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The marks, they seem to react to moonlight. Last night during the full moon, they were so bright that the night shift nurses could see them from across the room. Mrs. Hartwell from the front desk mentioned that her grandmother used to tell stories about markings like these, but surely that's just local folklore." The mention of folklore made Helena's skin prickle with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. Somewhere in the depths of her fractured mind, something stirred at the word, like a sleeping beast opening one ancient eye. She found herself looking toward the window, noting how the afternoon sunlight felt harsh and unwelcome against her skin, while the shadows in the corners of the room called to her with inexplicable comfort. "I need to get out of here," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. The walls of the sterile room felt like they were closing in, and every instinct she possessed screamed that this place was wrong for her. that she needed to be somewhere with earth beneath her feet and sky above her head. "Helena, you need to rest. Your body has been through tremendous trauma, and until we understand what these markings mean, they mean I don't belong here." The words came out with a certainty that shocked her. How could she be so sure of anything when she couldn't even remember her own life? But the conviction sat heavy in her chest, undeniable as gravity. These marks weren't a medical condition to be studied and treated. They were something far more significant, something that connected her to a world she couldn't remember, but somehow knew was calling to her. Dr. Morrison exchanged glances with the nurse, and Helena caught the subtle shake of his head that said more than words ever could. They were afraid of her, or at least afraid of what she represented. In the space of 3 days, she had become a medical anomaly, a puzzle they couldn't solve with their charts and tests and rational explanations. "There's a woman here to see you," the nurse said hesitantly. "She claims to be your aunt, though we couldn't verify the relationship. She's been waiting since yesterday, insisting she needed to speak with you as soon as you woke up." Helena's heart jumped at the possibility of answers, of someone who might know who she was before this awakening nightmare. But even as hope flickered to life in her chest, a deeper instinct warned her to be careful. If this woman really was family, where had she been for the past 3 days while Helena lay unconscious and alone? "Send her in," Helena decided, her voice steadier than she felt. Whatever answers waited for her, she needed to face them. The alternative was staying trapped in this sterile limbo, being poked and prodded while the marks on her skin continued to pulse with mysterious life. The woman who entered the room looked to be in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see far too much. She wore a simple black dress that spoke of old-fashioned values and practical living, but there was something about her presence that made the air in the room feel heavier, more significant. "Hello, Helena," she said, and her voice carried the weight of secrets and sorrows that spanned decades. "My name is Margaret Hartwell. I run the boarding house in Moonfall Valley, and yes, before you ask, I am your great-aunt, your grandmother's sister. I've been searching for you for a very long time." The name Moonfall Valley sent shivers down Helena's spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She could almost taste the name on her tongue, like a half-remembered lullaby or the echo of a childhood dream. But with the recognition came questions that multiplied faster than she could voice them. "If you're my family, why don't I remember you? And why haven't you been looking for me in a hospital? How did you even know I was here?" Margaret's smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who had carried difficult truths for far too long. "The answers you're looking for aren't the kind that can be spoken in a place like this, surrounded by people who wouldn't understand. But I can offer you somewhere safe to recover, somewhere you might begin to remember who you really are." "The markings," Helena said, lifting her arms so the silver patterns caught the light. "You know what they mean, don't you?" "I know they mean you're finally coming home," Margaret replied, and something in her tone made Helena's breath catch. It wasn't just recognition in the older woman's eyes, it was relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for years, waiting for this moment. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Hartwell, I can't in good conscience release a patient with such unusual symptoms into an uncontrolled environment. Helena needs medical supervision." "What Helena needs," Margaret interrupted gently but firmly, "is to be somewhere her body can heal properly. Your machines and tests can't explain what's happening to her because you're looking for medical answers to questions that are much older than modern medicine." The older woman turned back to Helena, and in her weathered features, Helena glimpsed something that looked like family resemblance. A shared, stubborn set to the jaw and the same deep-set eyes that seemed to hold storms. "The choice is yours, child. You can stay here and let them run more tests that will only tell you what you already know in your heart. Or you can come with me and start learning who you were always meant to be." Helena looked down at her hands. at the silver marks that seemed to pulse more strongly in Margaret's presence, as if responding to some invisible call. Every logical part of her mind screamed that she should stay in the hospital, should let the doctors figure out what was wrong with her. But logic felt like a flimsy shield against the growing certainty that her answers lay elsewhere. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "will you tell me the truth? All of it?" Margaret's expression grew grave. "I'll tell you what I can when you're ready to hear it. But Helena, some truths can only be lived, not spoken. Some things you'll have to discover for yourself, and some of those discoveries will change you in ways you can't imagine." The warning should have terrified her, but instead, it filled Helena with the first real sense of purpose she'd felt since waking up. The marks on her skin pulsed brighter, as if responding to her decision before she'd even fully made it. "I'll come with you," she said, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a lock clicking open after years of being sealed shut. "But I want to leave today." Dr. Morrison started to protest, but Margaret held up a hand that somehow carried enough authority to silence his objections. "I'll take full responsibility for her care, and, Doctor, I'd recommend you forget the details of her case. Some knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance, especially in matters like these." As Helena signed the discharge papers an hour later, her hand shaking slightly from weakness and anticipation, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was a stranger with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, but the silver marks that traced her skin seemed to glow with promise. Whatever waited for her in Moonfall Valley, whatever truths Margaret had hinted at, she was finally going to get answers. But as they walked toward the hospital exit, Helena couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking away from the last semblance of normal life she would ever know, and towards something that would demand everything she had to give, even if she couldn't remember what that was. The marks on her skin pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and for the first time since waking up, she wondered if some curses were meant to be embraced rather than cured. The late afternoon sun felt harsh against her hypersensitive skin as they stepped outside, but Helena forced herself not to flinch. Whatever was happening to her, whatever these marks meant, she was done hiding from it. Margaret led her toward an old truck that looked like it had seen better decades, and as Helena climbed into the passenger seat, she caught a scent on the breeze that made her heart race with inexplicable longing. It smelled like pine and rain, and something wild that called to parts of her she didn't know existed. And beneath it all, something else, something that made the marks on her skin burn with sudden intensity. As they drove away from the hospital and toward the mountains that loomed in the distance like sleeping giants, Helena pressed her hand against the window and whispered a promise to herself that she would find out who she really was, no matter what the cost. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed as they wound their way up mountain roads that seemed older than civilization itself, was that her arrival in Moonfall Valley had already been sensed by those who had been waiting for her return. In the deep woods that surrounded the small town, golden eyes opened in the darkness, and a howl echoed across the peaks that spoke of recognition, of longing, and of a destiny that had been postponed but never forgotten. The moon was rising, and Helena Blackthorne was finally coming home. Moonfall Valley revealed itself like a secret whispered in the dark, emerging from between towering pines as Margaret's truck rounded the final curve of the mountain road. Helena pressed her face to the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she took in the town that was supposed to hold the keys to her forgotten past. The buildings looked like they had grown from the earth itself, all weathered wood and stone foundations that spoke of generations who had called this isolated place home. But it was the way the shadows seemed deeper here, more alive somehow, that made her silver marks tingle with recognition. "It's beautiful," she whispered, though beautiful felt inadequate to describe the way the place called to something primal in her chest. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy above, casting everything in shades of amber and gold that made the world feel like a fairy tale waiting to unfold. "It's home," Margaret replied simply, but there was weight behind those words, layers of meaning that Helena sensed but couldn't quite grasp. "The boarding house is just ahead. It's been in our family for over 100 years, passed down from mother to daughter, keeper to keeper." The boarding house stood at the heart of the valley like a grandmother watching over her children. 3 stories of sturdy construction with wraparound porches and windows that seemed to glow with warm welcome. Flower boxes overflowed with late-blooming roses and herbs that filled the air with scents both familiar and mysterious. As Helena climbed the front steps, she could swear she heard the wood whisper beneath her feet, as if the house itself was greeting her return. "Your room is on the 2nd floor, 3rd door on the right," Margaret said, hefting Helena's single bag of belongings the hospital had provided. "It was your grandmother's room when she was your age. I think you'll find it suits you." The room was perfect in ways that made Helena's chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. Pale blue walls the color of dawn sky, antique furniture that invited touch, and windows that looked out over the forest where moonlight would soon paint everything silver. But it was the bookshelf that drew her like a magnet, filled with volumes that seemed to pulse with their own quiet magic. "I've arranged for you to work at the town library," Margaret said, setting the bag on the quilt-covered bed. "Emma Winters runs it, and she's been looking for help cataloging some of the older collections. It'll give you something to do while you recover, and perhaps you'll find some answers among the books." Helena nodded, though part of her wondered what kind of answers she might find in a small-town library. Still, the idea of being surrounded by stories and knowledge felt right in a way that made her marks hum with approval. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it. But tonight, you should rest. The full moon is only a few days away, and I suspect you'll find it intense." Something in Margaret's tone made Helena shiver. But before she could ask what that meant, the older woman had disappeared downstairs, leaving her alone with questions that multiplied like shadows at sunset. She unpacked her meager belongings, then found herself drawn to the window as darkness crept across the valley. The forest seemed to pulse with life, and she could swear she heard howls echoing in the distance, wild and haunting and somehow familiar. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the mountains in shades of fire. Helena walked to the library through streets where people nodded politely but kept their distance, their eyes lingering on her face as if searching for something. The whispers followed her like a second shadow, fragments of conversation that made her skin prickle with unease. "She looks just like her. Those eyes. It's uncanny. Poor child, she has no idea what's coming." The library was a sanctuary of worn wood and aged paper, the kind of place where secrets felt safe and knowledge waited patiently to be discovered. Emma Winters proved to be a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and gentle hands, but even she seemed to watch Helena with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "The historical collection is in the basement," Emma explained, leading Helena down narrow stairs that creaked with age. "Some of these books date back to the town's founding. I'm afraid the previous librarian wasn't very organized, so everything needs to be properly catalogued." The basement felt like stepping into another world, dimly lit and filled with shelves that stretched into shadows. But Helena found herself moving through the stacks with surprising confidence, her fingers trailing along spine after spine as if guided by invisible threads. It was while organizing a collection of local histories that she found it, wedged between 2 volumes about the town's logging industry, like it was hiding in plain sight. The journal was bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light, with silver clasps that made her marks tingle when she touched them. There was no name on the cover, but when Helena opened to the first page, her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time itself. October 15th, 1973. The marks appeared again today, silver lines tracing my arms like chains I cannot break. Dr. Morrison thinks it's some kind of allergic reaction, but I know better. Grandmother's stories weren't fairy tales, they were warnings. The full moon is coming, and with it, the choosing. I can feel them watching me from the forest, golden eyes that see too much, know too much. But I'm not ready. I'll never be ready for what they want me to become. Helena's hands shook as she read, recognition flooding through her like ice water. The handwriting was different, but the words could have been torn from her own thoughts. Someone else had experienced exactly what she was going through, someone who had lived in this same town and felt these same fears. She flipped through pages filled with detailed observations about the marks, their patterns, and their apparent connection to lunar cycles. The writer had documented everything with scientific precision, but between the clinical observations were glimpses of terror and confusion that made Helena's heart ache with sympathy. November 3rd, 1973. I met him today. The man from the forest, though calling him a man feels like a lie wrapped in human skin. He knew my name before I spoke it, knew about the marks, about what they mean. He says I'm his Luna, that I've been chosen to stand beside him as his equal. But equal feels like another word for prisoner, and his eyes hold storms I'm not sure I want to weather. Helena's pulse quickened as she read about encounters that felt both foreign and familiar. The unnamed woman described a pull toward the forest, dreams filled with running through moonlit trees on legs that weren't entirely human, and a connection to something wild and ancient that lived in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. November 20th, 1973. The truth is worse than I imagined. Not just werewolves, though that word feels too small for what they really are. A society that exists parallel to ours, with laws and traditions that stretch back centuries. And at the center of it all, the Alpha who claims me as his destined mate. I can feel his presence even now, miles away in the deep woods, like a storm front approaching. The marks on my skin burn brighter when he's near, as if they're calling him home to me. The entries became more sporadic after that, filled with accounts of failed escapes and growing acceptance of an impossible reality. But it was the final entry that made Helena's blood run cold. December 21st, 1973. The winter solstice. Tonight, I make my choice. I can run and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, or I can accept what I am and try to find some measure of happiness in a life I never wanted. The irony is that I think I'm falling in love with him, this creature who stole my choices and offered me a crown I never asked for. Perhaps that makes me weak, or perhaps it makes me wise. I suppose I'll find out. If anyone finds this journal, know that Helena Blackthorne faced her destiny with eyes wide open, and that sometimes the greatest courage comes from embracing the very thing that terrifies you most. The journal slipped from Helena's numb fingers, hitting the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the basement like a gunshot. Helena Blackthorne. Her own name, written in someone else's hand 50 years ago. But that was impossible. Unless you found it. Helena spun around to find a man standing at the bottom of the stairs, though she was certain she would have heard him approach. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to shift color in the dim light of the basement. But it was the way he moved, with predatory grace that suggested coiled power, that made her marks flare to life beneath her skin. "I'm sorry, the library is closed for inventory," she managed, though her voice came out shakier than she intended. There was something about him that made every instinct she possessed scream danger, even as another part of her was inexplicably drawn to the warmth that seemed to radiate from his skin. "I'm not here for books," he said, stepping closer with movements that were too fluid to be entirely human. "I'm here for you, Helena, though I suspect you already know that." Her name on his lips sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition that reached deeper than memory. The marks on her arms were burning now, pulsing in rhythm with her racing heartbeat, and she could swear they were glowing bright enough to see through her thin sweater. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, but they both knew it was futile. The journal at her feet was evidence enough that this moment had always been inevitable. "My name is Darius," he said, and even that simple introduction felt like a claiming, like he was marking territory she hadn't known belonged to anyone. "And you, Helena Blackthorn, are my Luna. You always have been." The basement suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Helena backed toward the stairs, but Darius made no move to follow her. He simply watched with eyes that seemed to glow with their own internal light, patient as a hunter who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That journal is 50 years old. I'm 26. His smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who carried secrets that spanned generations. Time moves differently for our kind. What you call impossible, we call inevitable. The Luna who wrote that journal was your grandmother, Helena. She died giving birth to your mother, who died giving birth to you. Each generation passing the gift and the burden down the line, each hoping the next might find a way to break the cycle. The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation stealing another piece of the normal life she'd been clinging to. "You're lying." "The marks don't lie," he said simply. "They appeared the moment you came of age, didn't they? Started as small silver lines that grew stronger with each passing year, until they became impossible to ignore. Your amnesia wasn't caused by trauma, Helena. It was caused by the awakening, by your true nature finally claiming what was always yours." Helena's legs gave out, and she sank onto the bottom step of the stairs, the journal forgotten at her feet. Everything was falling into place with terrifying clarity. The way Margaret had known exactly where to find her, the whispers that followed her through town, the way the forest called to her like a siren song. She wasn't just Helena Blackthorn. She was the Helena Blackthorn, the latest in a line of women destined to stand beside creatures that shouldn't exist. "What do you want from me?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "I want you to come home," Darius said, and his voice carried the weight of decades of longing. "I want you to take your place beside me and help me lead our people into a future where we don't have to hide in the shadows. But more than that, I want you to choose me not because of destiny or tradition, but because your heart recognizes what mine has always known." He knelt in front of her then, bringing himself to her eye level, and Helena found herself drowning in golden eyes that held depths she was afraid to explore. When he reached out to touch her face, his fingers barely grazing her cheek, her marks blazed to life with intensity that stole her breath. "I can feel your fear," he whispered. "But I can also feel your recognition. Part of you has been waiting for me your entire life, even when you didn't understand why. Part of you knows that you belong with me, in the forest, under the moon." Helena wanted to deny it, wanted to run back to the safety of Margaret's boarding house and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the marks on her skin were singing now, responding to his presence like tuning forks struck in harmony, and she could feel something inside her chest uncoiling like a flower opening to sunlight. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to understand what this means, what I'm being asked to give up." Darius nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him to step back and give her space. "The full moon is in 2 days. On that night, your transformation will be complete, whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you'll face it alone or with someone who's been waiting 50 years for your return." He rose to his feet with that same predatory grace, but paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Helena, your grandmother chose love in the end. She chose to stand beside my grandfather and help him build something better than what came before. She chose to trust that sometimes the scariest leaps are the ones that teach us how to fly. Then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of pine and rain and something wild that made Helena's heart race with longing she couldn't name. She sat alone in the basement, surrounded by books that held the history of a town built on secrets, clutching a journal that proved her entire life had been leading to this moment. The marks on her skin pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat or a countdown. And for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, Helena Blackthorne began to understand that some destinies couldn't be outrun, only embraced. But as she climbed the stairs back to the world of electric lights and rational explanations, she couldn't help but wonder what else was waiting to be revealed in the 2 days before the full moon rose and changed everything forever. The day before the full moon, Helena woke to find her reflection had become a stranger's face. The silver marks that had once been subtle traceries along her arms now covered her skin like intricate armor, spiraling across her collarbone and down her spine in patterns that seemed to shift and breathe with her pulse. But it was her eyes that terrified her most. No longer the soft brown she remembered, but shot through with threads of gold that caught the morning light like captured fire. She pressed her palms against the bathroom mirror, watching as the marks on her hands flared brighter at the contact with cold glass. "What's happening to me?" she whispered to her reflection. But the woman looking back at her seemed to already know the answer, seemed to be waiting for Helena to catch up to a truth that lived in her bones. Margaret was in the kitchen when Helena came downstairs, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle that looked older than the house itself. The scent that rose from the mixture was earthy and complex, carrying notes of pine and moonflower and something darker that made Helena's transformed senses real. "The awakening tea," Margaret explained without looking up from her work. "Your grandmother drank this same blend on her transformation night. It won't stop what's coming, but it will ease the transition and help you maintain yourself when the change begins. You knew this whole time." Helena's voice came out sharper than she intended, but 50 years of deception felt like a betrayal too large for politeness. "You knew what I was, what I would become, and you let me stumble around thinking I was sick or cursed." Margaret finally looked up, and Helena saw her own golden-threaded eyes reflected in the older woman's steady gaze. "I knew what you might become. But Helena, choice has always been the most important part of this process. I couldn't tell you who you were because you needed to discover it yourself, needed to want it, instead of simply accepting it as inevitable." The careful distinction felt like splitting hairs when Helena's entire world was reshaping itself around revelations that came too fast and too late. "And if I choose to reject it, if I decide I want nothing to do with Darius or his pack or any of this supernatural nonsense, then you'll spend tonight alone in agony as your body tears itself apart trying to transform without the anchor of acceptance." Margaret's words were brutal in their honesty. "And if you survive that, you'll spend the rest of your life fighting a nature that will only grow stronger with each passing moon until it drives you mad." Helena sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs suddenly too weak to support her weight. The silver marks on her arms pulsed in rhythm with her racing heart, and she could feel something wild and desperate clawing at the inside of her ribcage, like a caged animal sensing freedom. "Tell me about her," Helena said finally. "My grandmother. The real story, not the sanitized version you've been feeding me." Margaret poured the herbal tea into a cup that seemed to glow with its own internal light and set it in front of Helena, with hands that trembled slightly. Helena Blackthorne was the most beautiful and stubborn woman I ever knew. When the marks first appeared, she fought them for months, convinced she could will herself back to normal through sheer determination. She tried to leave Moonfall Valley twice, but the pull of this place, of him, always brought her back. Darius? His grandfather, actually. Magnus Nightwood, the Alpha who ruled these territories for over 60 years. He was patient with her in a way that surprised everyone who knew him. Most Alphas simply claim their lunas and expect submission, but Magnus courted your grandmother like she was a choice, rather than a destiny. Helena lifted the cup to her lips, and the tea tasted like moonlight and promises, warming her from the inside out in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. What changed her mind? A rival pack tried to take her. Margaret's expression darkened with memories that still carried the weight of old fear. They came in the night, thinking they could steal the Luna and weaken Magnus's claim to these lands. Your grandmother was human then, fragile, unable to defend herself against creatures that could tear apart steel with their bare hands. The cup rattled against the saucer as Helena set it down, her hands shaking with sudden understanding. He saved her. He saved her, and she saw him for what he really was. Not just the monster she'd been afraid of, but the man who would burn down the world to keep her safe. That night she chose to complete the transformation, chose to stand beside him as his equal, rather than hide behind him as his protected weakness. Helena could picture it with startling clarity, could almost see her grandmother's face as she made the decision that would reshape not just her own life, but the lives of daughters not yet born. And they were happy. They were extraordinary together. Margaret's smile was soft with remembered joy. Your grandmother didn't just become Luna. She revolutionized what it meant to hold that title. She insisted on shared leadership, on treating the human community as allies rather than potential threats. Under their rule, Moonfall Valley became a sanctuary where supernatural and human families could coexist. But something in Margaret's tone suggested the story didn't have a happy ending, and Helena braced herself for whatever tragedy was coming. What happened to them? The same thing that happens to all great loves, eventually. Time. Your grandmother's human lifespan was extended by the transformation, but not eliminated. She lived to see your mother born and raised, lived to know that the bloodline would continue. But when she died, Magnus couldn't survive the loss of his other half. The pack found him in the forest 3 days after her funeral, peaceful, as if he'd simply chosen to follow her wherever souls go, when they're finished with earthly forms. Helena felt tears. She didn't know she was crying until they dripped onto her hands, mixing salt with the silver patterns that seemed to pulse with sympathetic grief. It was a beautiful story and a tragic one, but more than that, it was a promise of what love could look like when it was chosen, rather than simply accepted. Darius isn't like his grandfather, Margaret continued carefully. He's been alone for decades, waiting for you with a patience that would be admirable if it weren't so clearly driving him toward desperation. The pack respects him, but they need their Luna to feel complete. And Helena, whether you choose him or not, you need to understand that rejecting this transformation means rejecting the very thing that makes you who you are. Before Helena could respond, the sound of breaking glass from upstairs shattered the kitchen's peaceful atmosphere. Margaret was on her feet instantly, moving with speed that belied her apparent age, and Helena found herself following despite every rational instinct screaming at her to run in the opposite direction. The window in Helena's room was destroyed, jagged shards scattered across the floor like crystalline teeth, but it was the man standing among the wreckage that made Helena's blood turn to ice in her veins. He was tall and broad like Darius, but where Darius radiated controlled power, this stranger felt like barely contained violence looking for an excuse to explode. "So this is the famous Helena Blackthorn," he said, and his voice carried an accent that spoke of territories far from Moonfall Valley. "Smaller than I expected, and more human. Are you certain she's worth all this fuss, Magnus's heir?" "Get out of my house, Vincent," Margaret said, but there was steel beneath her polite words. "You have no authority here, no right to threaten what is under my protection." Vincent laughed, and the sound made Helena's marks burn like acid beneath her skin. "Protection? From one old woman and a Luna who hasn't even completed her first transformation? Your protection is tissue paper against what's coming." "What do you want?" Helena asked, stepping forward despite Margaret's restraining hand on her arm. If this was about her, she wouldn't let others fight her battles. "I want what should have been mine 50 years ago," Vincent replied, his eyes shifting to gold that was harder and colder than anything she'd seen in Darius's gaze. "Your bloodline, your power, your position as Luna. My pack has waited generations for the chance to claim what the Nightwoods stole from us." "I don't belong to anyone," Helena said, and felt power surge through her words like electricity through copper wire. "And I certainly don't belong to you." Vincent's smile was all teeth and predatory intent. "We'll see about that tomorrow night. When the moon rises and your transformation begins, you'll have a choice to make. Submit to my claim and become Luna of the Shadowfang Pack, or watch everyone in this pathetic little town pay the price for your defiance." He moved toward the broken window with inhuman speed, but paused at the sill to deliver one final threat. "Oh, and Helena, Darius can't protect you from what's coming. He's powerful, but he's one alpha against an entire pack that's been preparing for this moment since before you were born. Choose wisely." Then he was gone, leaving only the scent of smoke and violence, and the sound of Helena's heart hammering against her ribs. Margaret was already moving, pulling heavy curtains across the destroyed window and muttering what sounded like protective incantations under her breath. "Pack your things," Margaret said without turning around. "You can't stay here tonight. Vincent's pack will be watching the house, waiting for the moon to rise and weaken your control." "Where can I go?" Helena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "To Darius, to the Packlands, where you'll be protected by more than just one old woman's fading magic." Margaret finally turned to face her, and Helena saw determination mixed with desperation in the older woman's expression. "Helena, I know this isn't the choice you wanted to make, but it's the only one that keeps you alive." Helena nodded, moving mechanically to gather the few belongings she'd accumulated during her short stay in Moonfall Valley. But as she packed, her hands kept returning to her grandmother's journal, the leather binding warm beneath her fingers, as if it still held echoes of the woman who had faced this same impossible decision 50 years ago. An hour later, Margaret's truck was winding through forest roads that seemed to grow darker and more primitive with each passing mile. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight, and Helena could swear she saw golden eyes watching from the shadows between trunks. "How will I know if I'm making the right choice?" Helena asked, as they drove deeper into territory that felt ancient and alive in ways that had nothing to do with normal forest ecology. "You won't," Margaret replied honestly. "But Helena, the right choice isn't always the easy choice, and the easy choice isn't always the right one. Your grandmother chose love over safety, chose partnership over independence, chose to become something new rather than remain something familiar. And yes, it cost her a normal human lifespan, but it gave her 40 years of extraordinary happiness and a legacy that's still protecting this valley." The road ended at a clearing where the late afternoon sunlight slanted through ancient pines like cathedral beams. In the center stood a house that looked like it had grown from the forest floor itself, all natural wood and stone that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. But it was the man waiting on the front porch that made Helena's breath catch in her throat. Darius stood perfectly still as they approached, but she could see the tension in every line of his body, could sense the barely controlled power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. When their eyes met across the clearing, Helena felt something fundamental click into place inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting her entire life to open. "You came," he said simply, but those two words carried the weight of decades of hope and fear and desperate longing. "I didn't have much choice," Helena replied, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She could have chosen to face the transformation alone, could have chosen to run or fight or any number of other options. But standing here in this clearing, looking into golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, she realized she'd been moving toward this moment since the first silver mark had appeared on her skin. "There's always a choice," Darius said, stepping down from the porch with movements that were human graceful but carried undertones of something much more dangerous. Even now, even with Vincent's pack circling like vultures, you can choose to face this alone if that's what you truly want. Margaret squeezed Helena's shoulder gently, then climbed back into her truck without another word. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Helena found herself alone with Darius in a clearing that felt like the center of the world, with the full moon rising somewhere above the canopy and silver marks on her skin that pulsed with increasing intensity. "Tell me what happens tonight," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her felt like chaos and electricity and wild hope. "Tonight, you become what you were always meant to be," Darius replied, extending his hand toward her like an invitation to dance. "Tonight you choose whether to do it alone or with someone who's been waiting 50 years to stand beside you under the moon." Helena looked at his outstretched hand, at the promise of partnership and protection, and something that might grow into love if she was brave enough to let it. Above them, the moon was rising and she could feel its pull in her bones like gravity reversed. The silver marks on her skin were singing now, calling her toward a transformation that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and the world. But as she reached out to take Darius's hand, as her fingers touched his and sent electricity shooting through every nerve ending, Helena Blackthorne realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. Some things were simply inevitable, written in silver patterns on skin that had been waiting a lifetime to finally come home. The moon broke through the canopy above them, bathing the clearing in light that turned everything silver and magical and wild. And Helena felt her transformation begin with a joy that surprised her and a pain that would remake her into something extraordinary. But she wasn't facing it alone, and as Darius's hand tightened around hers and his eyes blazed with golden fire, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The curse had become a blessing, just as the journal had promised, and Helena Blackthorne was finally, truly, coming home.